Louise, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining. I'm really excited about you being here with us because you transitioned from a contingent search to retained, and
Yeah.
a lot of people from our community, a lot of people who joined the Tech Recruitment Academy, they also struggle with the contingent search because it's been much more difficult recently. So you transitioned, you are also teaching other people how to go through the transition. So what was it like for you?
Wow. I guess for me, it was a bit of a surprise because I, my perception of retained work was always that it was for very senior or executive positions, and it wasn't appropriate or suitable for the level of the position that I was working on, which was not particularly senior. Anything from let's say 50, 60 USD, up to say 200 USD, like tops really. And so the bottom end of that really wasn't senior at all. And I didn't think that it was possible to work on a retained basis at those levels. And so when I came across in the firm that I was working at a guy who was doing that, it was a bit of a surprise. And we were quite quickly tasked with working together on a project to shore up revenue for an investment that the firm were about to go through. And the permanent division had come in quite low, well, very low on the valuation because of the lack of predictability and forecastability of the revenue, because it was all contingent pretty much. And we were tasked with shoring up that revenue and making it forecastable, or it wouldn't have made it through the transaction. And so I quite quickly learned a lot in a really short space of time about what's possible with retained, in that sort of ballpark. Globally, a lot of the clients, some were in the UK, some were in Central Europe. Then we did more and more in North America and Asia Pacific, Middle East, but it just took off for us. And we went quite soon, region by region, then from all contingent to all retained. And that firm now does about $12 million a year in retained revenue and doesn't work contingently at all. So for me, it was an eye-opener. It was a surprise. It was a joy because suddenly I was only working with clients that were committed to working together. And I went from I had a good contingent fill rate. I was probably about 30%, 35% on my fill rate, which is good, as you probably know. I mean, it can be as low as 10, 15. But that changed. That went right up to 97% my fill rate. So I was making 3 times as much money working on the same amount of work, or I could cut my work by 2/3 and still make the same amount. And that was just a revelation. So I just couldn't believe that I hadn't come across this way of working sooner, and that not everybody worked like that. And that's what for everything that happened since then has just been a surprise as to why isn't this more widely used? Why isn't it taught? Why isn't it the way that we're educated as recruiters when we come into the industry? Why isn't that standard practice? Because everybody has a better experience, everybody, without exception. The recruiter, the candidate, the client, the referees that you take references from, every single person involved in that process has a better experience than they would do if they were working without any financial commitment. So yeah, I could talk about it all day, but that's just a glimpse into my experience.
Awesome. And it's also more fulfilling, right? Not just financially, but also it must be more fun to fill 97% of all these roles compared to 15 or 20, right? So
oh God,
definitely.
absolutely. Like
Yeah.
I just got to the stage where I think I would have left the industry if I hadn't have moved to retained at that point. I was a single parent. My time was getting more and more precious. the children were young and I wanted to be with them, and I did not want to be spending time on stuff that I was being messed about on or that was just disappearing or and so from a fulfillment perspective and a level of professionalism and career satisfaction, just even daily satisfaction, just the interaction with clients was purposeful and professional and partner driven rather than this kind of master slave type relationship that I was getting so frustrated with. So yeah, absolutely more fulfilling in every way.
Awesome. And a lot of people in our community, they work on IT roles, the individual contributors like software developers, backend, front-end, DevOps engineers. Like, would you say the retained model is also suitable for these types of roles?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I don't necessarily believe that every position needs a retained solution. I do believe everybody has a better experience with it, and it is always my preferred route. But I will never, if there are certain circumstances where I won't necessarily push it as a solution, and those are where the contingent model is working well.
That's
so that doesn't make sense.
Very interesting that you say it, because just 2 weeks ago, I was on a call with a prospective client, and they were like, oh, well, we are looking for one person and we work with 2 other agencies, and you seem to be, a great fit, to work with as well. So they were like, shopping for contingent recruiters. And I didn't onboard them because I'm also not working on contingent roles anymore. But I was thinking, well, they are working with 2 agencies. They want a third one. It's not a good deal for them either, right? Because none of them is committed. But when I try to propose them, like, hey, why don't you work just with me? They pulled back. So what do you do to sell a client on this new way of working?
Yes, it can be really hard to educate clients in that situation because they don't understand what you're trying to do. You're trying to make sure that they get a better result and that they have a better experience, but they think you're just trying to get money up front or trying to push all the other recruiters out. So it can be very difficult. One of the main things that I find is very helpful is to diagnose first how well the model they're using at the moment is working for them. So why are they talking to you to try and bring another person into the mix? What is it about what's happening at the moment that isn't working? Because what we don't want to do is just apply more of the same model. Because unfortunately, what happens when you put more recruiters in the mix, the client thinks they're going to get a duplication of effort, but actually it's exactly the opposite of that happens. Because, as you know, the positions that we're more like, as a contingent recruiter, we're more likely to fill, go higher on our list of priorities. Yeah. And once things start happening that make it harder to fill, like a difficult location or a niche skill set or an unknown brand, they go further down our list of priorities. And then when there's more agencies involved, it goes even further down the list of our priorities. So the client actually gets a dilution of effort applying more recruiters to a position, not a duplication. It actually makes the whole situation worse for everybody because, unfortunately, the people that really need to get approached and the people that really need to be found are quite hard to find for those types of positions, and they need more effort, not less. And sadly, the people that do get approached tend to get approached by different people, but about the same position. And that ends up downgrading the opportunity in the eyes of potential candidates. A bit like a house, if you put like 7 for sale signs outside, it looks desperate. It's the same impact. So for all those reasons, to solve the problem that they're trying to solve, putting extra recruiters into the mix is actually going to make the problem worse and not solve it. So, but it can, the way to be able to educate them on that is to diagnose and get them to see for themselves the problem that they're facing and why they're facing the problem, and then to be able to articulate what a retained model allows us to do. The financial commitment from them allows us to put in place a rigorous and thorough process, and importantly, to commit to working with that client until we reach your results, not by adding more recruiters that isn't working for them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that actually sounds great. And you mentioned just a while ago that in the company you worked for, you went country by country and switched all these clients from contingent to retained
Yeah,
model. So
yeah.
what does the process look like? Do you reach out to an existing client and say like, hey, this doesn't work. Let's start paying upfront, or what
Yeah, I
do
mean,
you?
it can be as simple as that. It can be, certainly the easiest ones to convert are usually the ones where the contingent model is falling over, and it makes sense for them to take a different approach.
Mm.
It doesn't make sense for them to keep applying the same method and expect something different to happen. So providing that you can articulate it well enough and explain what you want to do, why you want to do it, give them the comfort and the reassurance around the pricing, because normally that's a worry for them and it's going to be expensive, and also alleviate any concerns they have around, what happens if you don't fill it? And what if I give you this money up front and you run off into the sunset, and all those kinds of concerns. As long as you're able to do that, it makes sense for them to apply a different model, because they're not getting what they need from what they're using right now.
Mm.
So
So
yes,
what?
that can be the easiest way.
So what actually happens if the client pays a retainer, but as a recruiter you don't really find anyone suitable?
Well, the answer to that is the commitment from the client allows you to commit in return. So it allows you to commit to putting in place a rigorous and a robust process and to making sure you reach a result. What you can't guarantee is that that result is going to be exactly what the client sets out to find, because you can't guarantee that that person exists. And you can't guarantee that even if they do exist, they're going to be ready to make a move and want to come and work for your client right now, because you can't manufacture people and you can't make people do things against their will. But what a retained process allows you to guarantee is that you can take a thorough brief and you can line that brief up with what does exist in the market as best as humanly possible. That you can then systematically identify all the people that look to meet that brief and approach them by every means possible, including, of course, direct and professional headhunting, which the contingent model doesn't always allow you the time to do. And that you can take the most compelling message to each and every one of those candidates with the employee value proposition of your client, and that you can bring to the table all of the candidates that are humanly possible to bring to the table. And you can guarantee that at the end of the process, the client will be making their decision from all of the options that are available to them in the market at this time. And that if they choose, for whatever reason, not to make a hire from the search, that they will have all of the data, all of the intelligence, all of the knowledge and insights, and all of your support to help them make a decision as to what they do instead.
Well, this actually sounds like a great sales pitch, really, for the client. Not just the answer to the question, but the proper sales.
Well, that is the answer to the question.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well rehearsed.
I mean,
Awesome.
I think when you're explaining retained solutions and overcoming those worries, it's important to be clear and concise in explaining the answers, because I suppose I see it as my duty that the client understands exactly why I want to do this and what it's going to enable me to do and the position that they're going to be in at the end. And if they then decide, actually, no, we don't want to do that, that's fine. That's okay. They've made their decision with all of the information to know what their different options are. And I'm cool with that. If they decide after that, okay, actually, I think we just want to carry on trying it contingent, no problem. Good luck. I hope it works. Hope it goes well. And you know where I am if you change your mind or if you don't get where you need to go. But of course, hopefully I'll have the capacity at that time to be able to take the project on. But I do see it as an obligation, because clients just don't understand. And so I put a lot of effort into helping them to understand why I want to work with them in this way. And that's maybe why it comes across as very, clear.
Awesome.
I don't know.
And yeah, there are some people also in our community who are senior. They
Mm,
have been on the market for several years, but have not worked in the IT industry. Well, that's why they join, some of our
right.
programs or the community.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
look for new opportunities. Some of them transition from being employees to working freelance, and they look for the first client to work for. So hopefully they don't go the contingent path anymore. Now when they, hear you say, how much a retained search is better. But now if
Mm,
you think about this person, someone in the US or Canada or the UK, someone who is really at the beginning of the solopreneur career, like how to get the
mm.
first client for the retained search, and what type of a position would you start, or what type of a client? How would you go about getting the first client on board?
I mean, my approach to business development is always the same in that I like to take the path of least resistance first. So my approach is always a combination of the lowest hanging fruit for the short term, quick wins, and then a longer term strategy for the acquisition of maybe larger or clients that are further away from my periphery. So if it was me and I was starting now, then I would look for all that low hanging fruit of clients that I'd worked with already in my previous job, or companies that I've worked for in my work. I'd look at all the companies I'd worked for that were happy with what I did, all the employees, all the peers, all the managers that I'd worked with, that I'd carried out projects for, that I'd done good work for, and approach them as close to my area of expertise as possible. So if, for example, I know I was a head of products and we had a head of product do our training and do extremely well with it, who had no clients and weren't fully retained. So it is definitely possible. In the same with insurance broker. We had an insurance broker do the course not long ago, no recruitment experience, and has gone all retained, and an oil trader. So it absolutely can be done. And I'd have to ask them to see, where their first client came from. But certainly my advice is always to go with people that you are close to, stick as close to your niche and your area of expertise. If, for example, you're a head of products, as Tim was, your immediate peers, other heads of product, peers and employees that he'd worked with, the firm that he worked with as a head of product, and he'd recruited for his team in that company. So the first sensible place to start is those positions, the positions that he was recruiting for internally.
Mm.
So that's
Awesome.
where I would start. And then the secret to getting it retained, of course, is simply to get the client, is to diagnose whether the contingent model is working. Now, in Tim and Zoe and Carly, who are all good examples of this, their cases, the first clients that they approached and had FaceTime with, straight away they started to uncover that they already knew the contingent model wasn't working, but were able to uncover, and get them to admit that they're not having a particularly good time with the contingent model, and it isn't very enjoyable, it isn't very efficient. And actually, it made perfect sense for them to explain that's exactly why they didn't work like that and they worked like this, and they wanted the opportunity. And I always like to ask for the opportunity to demonstrate capability in the first instance. So you don't need to marry me. We don't even need to get engaged. Just let me show you what I'm capable of on our first assignment.
Mm.
And if necessary, carry that work out pro bono, either very discounted or complimentary, to demonstrate the effectiveness of working in that way. And then you've got to smash the delivery out of the park and put a really nice process in place that yields the result every time. And you've got the client for as long as you want it.
Awesome. Well, that sounds kind of easy. I know it's not easy to execute, but the
Yeah.
process seems straightforward. But you also mentioned something important, the niche.
Mm.
So would you suggest someone who is rather at the beginning of the recruiting career to focus on just one role or a segment? For example, in
Yeah.
IT, we have cloud or DevOps or front end, back end development. Like, is this where you are heading with this niche?
Yeah, I mean, I like to have a specialism. It doesn't necessarily need to be a discipline for me. For me, it can be an industry. So it doesn't matter whether it's cloud or DevOps or mobile development, whatever it might be. For me, it was chemicals, specialty chemicals. So there was lots of different types of positions within that, but it was technical positions within specialty chemicals.
Yeah.
And the same with Jordan, one of my fellow coaches, his was industrial technology, and he would do MDs, heads of, VPs, but across HR, sales, product, and it was it was an industry rather than a discipline. But yes, whatever you pick as your area of expertise, focus on, that's your pointy end in. It's not to say that you don't end up doing other stuff around it, because I've always found that that's helpful, because then you've always got a few fingers in other pies in case you need to make a move and you need to kind of shuffle things around. So we would always say that we specialized completely in something, but then always do a little bit of other stuff on the side.
Yeah.
But the way in was the niche that enabled me to stand out from more generalist firms and build up a specialist area and an area of knowledge. And it makes a big difference, especially when the more senior you go, the more that makes a difference, I found, because there's so many generalist executive search firms. You get quite a lot of specialist contingent agencies. They're not actually specialists, as you've discovered. They profess to be specialists, but they don't actually have any experience in it. So either end, you can stand out, but I'm definitely recommending having a niche or an area of expertise. Yes. And if you want any advice on picking a niche, like, it sounds a bit cruel, but go for the pain. Go for painful stuff, difficult stuff, awkward. It's difficult to deliver, granted, but it's easier to win.
So when you say painful, difficult, do you mean difficult roles to fill?
Yeah. Or locations, or smaller firms that struggle to attract talent against the bigger, the bigger firms. Yep. So difficult in any kind of way, whether that is geography or niche.
Okay. And now if we compare the compensation for the contingent versus the retained model, would you say that the retained comes with a higher percentage or lower? Because from the client standpoint, there is a prepayment. So probably logically the percentage should be lower, no? But at the same time, there is more work involved. So from the recruiter's perspective, probably it should be higher. No, I'm just kind of, thinking out loud.
No, I like the thought process. So for me, no, it should never be lower. It should never be lower. If you're selling retained search on a lower price point, then your sales process and techniques aren't good enough. If you have to make it cheaper to get them to buy it, then you're not articulating it well enough. It is more work, it's more commitment, and you're partnering with your client to reach a result. And you're not going to be able to do that at a low rate. It's not going to be commercially viable for very long. Like I say, for the first project, maybe, to get the opportunity to demonstrate capability. Okay. But on a longer term basis, even a medium term basis, it very quickly becomes unprofitable. And that's not a business model that you want to deploy. So it should always be, for me, it should always be at least the same. And in most cases, more.
And now with, for example, the higher salaries in IT, sometimes the client push back and say like, hey, the salaries keep increasing. Why should also the percentage be the same for, senior Java developers? Should it not be lower for the more senior individual contributor roles? So have you also seen something like this happening on the market, or is it just, a wishful thinking of
I mean, most firms have a sliding scale that increases with the seniority of the position. It's generally because the experience of the resource that's handling the assignment needs to be different. So the lower level positions can be handled by more junior associates, and therefore that is more cost effective. So it can be done for a lower price point. And yet, when you're carrying out executive work, you need the gravitas and the credibility of a senior experienced partner, and therefore that costs more. And that's usually why there's an increase in fee for executive work. But there's no need within those bands for it to be applied for every assignment that it's a percentage of the salary. I don't believe that. I'm always quite happy to fix a flat fee. And that way nobody is influenced by the level of the salary of the candidates. And it feels more like a level playing field. Not that I or any of the people that I train would be and would go for a candidate that's more expensive to make a bigger fee, but sometimes there can be a perception that the client has. So if that's a worry, then I'm always happy to fix a fee.
Awesome. So you calculate some potential or average commission, and then you just have this as a fix.
Yeah.
And for the retained search, there is also common to have different milestones, right? So the one payment is split into 2 or 3 installments or tranches.
It is, yeah, and that those milestones are different depending on usually the experience or the experience of the firm. So if you look at the Shrek firms, are you familiar with that acronym?
No.
So Spencer Stewart, Heidrick and Struggles, Russell Reynolds, Egon Zehnder and Korn Ferry. So they're the biggest search firms in the world. They're the big 5. And they've been executing work on a fully retained basis for over 100 years. I don't know how old they are, old. With no, I don't mean it in that way, but yeah, they're established, put it that way. And the way that they base their pricing is it's 30% of total compensation. And that's split into 3 stages. The first stage is on commencement, the second 30 days later, and the remainder is the balance is paid. Well, the third stage is paid 30 days after that. So it doesn't matter where the project is. It doesn't matter what's been found, what's not been found. By the end of 60 days, there's been a full fee on that search paid. If a candidate is then hired, the balance that's then adjusted in accordance with the compensation of the actual candidate offered is then, there's actually 4 stages in a traditional retained executive search.
Okay, well,
interesting,
that
isn't it?
Sounds quite aggressive, I would even say.
That's the way they work. That's the way they work. And the principle of it is they are professional services firms and they are carrying out professional service. You don't pay for the candidate, you pay for the search. Whatever happens as a result of that, the client can choose to make a hire from that search or not. Entirely up to them. They will pay for the search to be executed. Now, you look at the alternative to that and the smaller, less established boutiques, sometimes called, search firms that are maybe newer to search and maybe operating at slightly lower levels. And you typically see a model that is 30% of sometimes base salary, sometimes total compensation, and usually flexible, whereas the Shrek firms tend to be pretty rigid in their pricing. And that's paid 1/3 on commencement, 1/3 on agreement of shortlist, and then the balance on the accepted offer to the candidate. So that is based on performance milestones. But what that means is that last stage is still contingent upon making the placement. So it isn't actually fully retained.
Okay, so I like the previous model a bit
more. Me too, yeah.
Now when you compare these two, but I also like how you frame this as a professional service company, which I think a lot of recruiters who work on the contingent search, they kind of like this attitude, right? Sometimes clients come and they behave like we are the kind of not professional service companies, but rather just some helpers or assistants, and if they don't want to pay, they don't pay, who cares, right? But obviously that's not good for us in the recruiting space. But I guess I'll need to re-listen to this framing that you just shared with us.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the holy grail. The more work, in my experience, the more work that I did on a retained basis, and the more I learned about the execution of search projects, the better I became at articulating and explaining to clients how I wanted to work with them and how it worked and what I was going to do. So in my experience, the more you get comfortable with the delivery, the proper best practice retained search delivery, and the better you get at that, the easier it is to reposition your sales offering.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, the reason I say that is because when a lot of people look at retained and selling retained, they immediately think, I need to learn how to sell it. But actually, you need to learn how to deliver it in order to learn how to sell it. And that took me quite a while to realize. And in fact, when I first started teaching people, I hadn't really realized that that was how I learned. And it took me a while. It took lots of different ways of teaching other people to realize that actually that's where we start. So we don't teach the full delivery process at the beginning of our training, but we give you enough for you to, I don't want to just matter about, but the essence of it is that if you want to get into retained search, understand the delivery first, and that will help you sell it.
And it's interesting that you said, because in IT, it feels like it always was the proper headhunting. I mean, always. I mean, last 4 years when it was really hard, there was a huge talent shortage. So we had to like headhunt candidates, message from the left and right, send email sequences and whatnot. So it feels like everyone who has been working in IT recruiting like is already on this headhunting mode. They just are not paid this way.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. There are a lot of people that are, and I was the same, right? I was, a lot of the stuff I was working on, these are polymer scientists and rare, you know, there's maybe 10 or 15 people in the world that can do some of the positions that I was working on a contingent basis. Anyway, so I understand, you know, the need to headhunt anyway, regardless of what model you're working on, and that a lot of contingent recruiters, and loads of the ones I work with, are already doing the vast majority of things that you would do in a retained process, and yet not being compensated for it, or not having the commitment of a financial commitment from the client. But it isn't just the implementation of rigorous headhunting. Because sometimes in a do we have time for me to carry on?
Yeah.
So sometimes in a retained search, because you put a rigorous process in place, and because you headhunt, you will find a candidate that you wouldn't have found, right, on a contingent basis. Sometimes when you're headhunting, you find someone you wouldn't have found if you didn't. I get that, right? And that's great. And that's the reason why sometimes retained can succeed where contingent can fail, because you've got the time to do more of that, basically, right? That's sometimes. But what I've learned over the years is that in some cases, quite a lot, what happens in a proper retained search is that a client will hire somebody that they wouldn't have hired in a contingent process. And the reason that happens is not because we found anybody different. It's simply because the process that we've put in place and the transparency of that process has enabled the client to be confident that that is the best result available to them in the market at this time. And they've had the confidence to make that hire. Whereas in a contingent process, they've thought that there might be somebody better out there, or they've then, oh, I think I just want to see some more CVs. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, or even 6 weeks later, or 6 months later, they might have thought, actually, we probably should have hired Janet.
Yeah.
Because actually she was but we lost her months ago because we thought we were going to find somebody better. So the contingent process isn't helpful to be able to drive a client to make a decision and to give them the information they need to be able to make that decision. So in many cases, the retained model will succeed on the process that you take the client through, not necessarily the candidate that you find.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say how important the process itself is, and the transparency as well, which I guess is a part of why the client pays the retainer.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, and you also mentioned the shortlist a while ago, shortlist of the candidates. So would you suggest fellow retained search recruiters to send a batch of candidates at once, or just keep sending candidates as they come, because that's probably more the contingent model, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or is
Yeah.
it different?
Yeah, well, I mean, for exactly the reason that I just mentioned, drip feeding candidates through is really unhelpful. It's really unhelpful. There's so many reasons why it's unhelpful. One is that the client then is in a situation where they need to make a decision on a candidate having absolutely no idea of what their other options are. And when you give a client an option at the beginning of that project, do you want to make a decision having no idea what the other options are, or would you like to make a decision knowing what all your other options are? They choose the latter.
Yeah.
So most of them don't want to be drip fed candidates. I would never do it anyway, even if they did. And I've had to push back on it many times with clients that don't understand why, but it always causes problems. Partly it's because you might find the best candidate first, and whilst they then look for comparisons, which they more often than not do, you lose them. But also because of the benchmark that you then set. There's one or two things that can happen, or one of three. You find the best candidate first, they're absolutely amazing. You then lose them because they haven't got anything to compare it to, or they dilly-dally on their decision because you haven't given them all the data. And then there's nobody better. So they aren't ever confident to make that hire because nobody stacks up to Janet. Or it isn't a particularly good candidate. You think it's a good candidate, but because you've just put one in and had no transparency of being able to assess a shortlist, they actually think, you've missed the mark. And they then don't trust you to carry out the rest of the assignment. And they question everything that you do after that because that candidate wasn't quite right. It's so, so risky for so many reasons. You obviously could just lose that candidate and then not find any more. That could be the only one. And that's the other scenario. And that would be devastating too. So my advice is always to execute the search in its entirety and bring the project to a position where the client is then making their decision from all of the options that are available to them at that time.
Well, I like this consultative approach. You are almost like a consultant facilitating the whole process and
absolutely,
which is so much different from the standard contingent model, where often junior recruiters do some basic search, they send CVs without any further thoughts, no reports or whatever, right? And they hope for the best. So.
Yeah, and right, sometimes that works, sometimes that works. And that's why when I'm explaining it to a client, in many cases, the contingent model does work just fine. If it's a low-level position, if there's lots of candidates available, if it doesn't matter that we have the best candidate, then put an advert on, field some response, call a few candidates, send a few CVs, and it's fine. And if that's working, don't change it. Carry on doing it. If you're getting what you want when you want it, and it's a relatively enjoyable process, carry on doing what you're doing, because most people aren't. So just carry on doing that. But it's where it's niche, or where it's candidate short, or where it's really competitive, or awkward locations, not necessarily senior, sometimes senior, where they need the best. It's got to be the best that we can get, or they actually want specific people from specific firms. Or it could be multiple, like 1 or 2 is relatively easy, but 5 or 6 starts to get really difficult. In any of those scenarios, then the contingent model starts to fall over. And in those situations, it doesn't make sense to put a model in that's already not working. And instead, that's where I'd put a retained solution in.
Awesome. Well, I feel like I could listen to your advice for the next 2 hours. But I also want to be mindful of your time. And for other recruiters, you also run a podcast that is only focused on retained search, right? So
that's right. Yeah.
If they would like to learn more, they can just subscribe and get obsessed about retained search as you are. So
yes, absolutely.
Where can they find the podcast?
I think it's still called Retrained Search, the podcast. So instead of retained, we're called Retrained.
Retrained.
So Retrained, yes. So we run a firm that teaches contingent recruiters how to work on a retained basis. So we're retrained, and we have a podcast totally free. We give loads of help every single episode. We give you help on pricing, on terms, on selling, on delivering. It's packed full of help. So yeah, please have a listen. And if it helps you, I'm delighted.
Awesome. Well, I'll subscribe as well. We got connected on LinkedIn, but yeah, I'll subscribe to your podcast as well.
Oh, that's nice, Michael. Thank
Cool. So
you.
I'll include the links in the show notes, and yeah, we
Cool.
will keep in touch. Thanks a lot for sharing
Awesome.
all these insights, and I hope to see you soon on
It's a
LinkedIn.
pleasure. It's a pleasure. Anytime. If you want me to come back and talk about any of it in more detail or be more specific, then I'd be delighted. Always happy to help.
Wonderful. Thank you. See you soon again.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael.